There are families that keep secrets the way other families keep furniture. Passed down. Polished. Never touched, but always there in the room. My family had one secret. Just one. But it was large enough to fill every room in the house, and we lived around it for 30 years without ever saying its name aloud. The secret had a name. The name was Agnes. She was my sister. And I was told to forget her. I want to tell you how well I obeyed that instruction. I want to tell you what 50 years of obedience looks like when it finally runs out. The first thing I remember about Agnes is her hands. She was 6 years older than me, which meant that when I was small she was the tall one, the one who knew things, the one who taught me what the flowers along the creek were called and which ones you could eat and which ones would make you sick. She had long hands. Careful hands. She could braid hair and shell corn and sew a straight seam and do all three things well, which I never could. I was always the clumsy one and Agnes was always the one who did things right. I had been thinking about those hands for 80 years. That tells you something about what was done to us. We grew up on a tobacco farm in Jefferson County, Kentucky, about 9 miles southeast of Louisville. Not in the city was its own world and we had no part in it. We were farm people. My father's family had worked that land since before I was born, and his father before him, and the expectation was simply that the land would continue and the family would continue and nothing would change except the seasons. That was the life. That was what was intended. The trouble with intentions is that people do not always follow them. There were 4 of us children. Agnes was the eldest, born in 1834. Then my brother Daniel, born in 1837. Then me, Mary Louisa, born the 3rd of February, 1840. And then the youngest, my sister Ruth, born in 1843, the last child my mother had before her health began to fail. Agnes and I were the ones who were close. Daniel was my father's shadow from the time he could walk, always in the fields, always learning what a boy needed to learn for the life that was waiting for him. Ruth was young enough that she came into the family at a different time, a different atmosphere, and she grew up with different air in her lungs than the rest of us. Agnes and I shared a room until I was married. 6 years apart in age, but we might have been the same person in some ways, the same way of going still when something troubled us, the same habit of watching people's faces for what they were not saying. I learned that habit from her, I think. She had been watching our father's face since before she could name what she was looking for. What she was looking for was safety. And she never quite found it. I did not understand that when I was a child. I understand it now. I am 89 years old and I have had a great many years to understand things I could not see clearly when I was small. When I think of the room we shared, I think of winter nights mostly, the cold coming through the single window, the quilt my grandmother had made pulled up to our chins, Agnes talking in the dark the way she could only talk in the dark because the dark was the one place my father's presence did not entirely reach. She talked about what she was reading. About the farm and what she wished were different. About the creek in summer and the way the light came through the sycamore branches in July and made patterns on the water. She noticed things like that. She was always noticing things that had no practical use and that she had to keep to herself during the day because there was no space in our daytime lives for noticing the light on the water. The year everything changed was 1853. I was 13 years old. Agnes was 19. And our family, our careful, respectable, God-fearing, neighbor-watching family, walked up to the edge of ruin and looked over. What happened next is what I have carried for 76 years. And what I have never, until this moment, said in full. To understand what happened to Agnes, you have to understand my father. His name was Caleb Benton. He was born in 1808 and he was 50 years old in 1858, which was when he died, too early, from a fever that came on in summer and did not leave. But in the years when Agnes and I were growing up, he was very much alive and very much the center of everything. He was not a large man physically. Medium height, lean, with hands that had gone rough from tobacco work before he was 20 and never softened after. He had a neat, contained way of moving, nothing wasted, nothing given away. He dressed carefully for church and for any occasion where neighbors would see him, and the carefulness of his dress was the same as the carefulness of everything else about him. It was about what other people observed. My father cared about observation. Not in a vain way. I want to be fair to him, the way I try to be fair to everyone I have spent a lifetime being less than fair to in my thoughts. He did not care about being seen because he was proud. He cared about being seen because he believed that reputation was a man's second life. That what people said about you in the county outlasted what you felt in private. That the opinion of your neighbors was a form of currency, and a man who lost it could not buy it back with any amount of honest labor afterward. He had gotten this from his own father, and his father had gotten it from his. It was handed down the same way the farm was handed down, not written anywhere, never explicitly taught, but present in every decision that was made in our house. The county we lived in was a particular kind of place. Kentucky in those years was not the deep South and not the North either. It was border country in every sense, geographically, politically, socially. Louisville was a river city, a trading city, a place where people arrived and left and where fortunes moved. The county outside it had its own slower life, the life of farms and churches and families whose names meant something because they had been in the same place long enough to mean something. Reputation in such a place was not abstract. It was practical. It determined whose sons your sons could work alongside. It determined which families would marry into yours. It determined the price a man could ask for his tobacco and whether the buyer would honor the agreement. It determined whether, when you walked into the dry goods store in town, the man behind the counter greeted you with warmth or with the particular coolness that meant something had been heard. All of these things turned, quietly and invisibly, on what people believed about your family. My father knew this. He had been taught to know it. And he had built his life around protecting the thing that made it possible. He was a church-going man. Not fervently so, not the kind of man who read scripture aloud at the table every evening or spoke of the Lord in ordinary conversation. But he attended church every Sunday without fail, and he sat in the same pew, and he greeted the minister with the same firm handshake, and he was known as a man who met his obligations. A man who meets his obligations. That was the highest praise available in the world my father lived in. He was not unkind to us. I want to say that, and I want it to be understood correctly. He fed us, clothed us, kept the farm running, kept the roof sound. He did not drink beyond what was social. He did not raise his hand to my mother or to any of us children. By the measures of his time and his place, he was a good man. But there was something in him that had no room for error. No room for the kind of mistake that could not be hidden or corrected. He had been building something his whole life, a standing, a reputation, a position in the county that represented decades of careful, consistent behavior, and the idea that one person's action could undo all of it was not something he could tolerate. He could not make space for it. The structure he had built was too rigid to flex, and things that cannot flex will break before they bend. When 1853 arrived, and my sister Agnes did what she did, my father's entire life narrowed to a single problem. How to keep anyone from knowing. That was the problem he solved. And the solving of it cost us Agnes. And the cost of Agnes was something we paid for the rest of our lives, whether we called it by that name or not. I should tell you about Agnes before I tell you what happened to her. I should tell you who she was when she was whole, before the year that broke her. Agnes Elizabeth Benton was 19 years old in 1853, and she was the most capable person I have ever known. I do not say that because she was my sister. I say it because it is the plain truth. The way the sky is blue or the creek runs east, it is simply what was so, and I observed it clearly enough over the 13 years I lived alongside her to be certain of it. She could do everything. Not as a boast, as a fact. She managed the kitchen garden better than my mother, who was always willing to say so. She kept the household accounts with a precision my father relied on but never acknowledged. She could read faster than any of us, and she read everything she could find, the Bible, the almanac, whatever newspapers came through the county, letters that neighbors brought to share because paper was scarce and news traveled in any form it could. She read the way I imagine a person drinks when they have been a long time thirsty. She was not beautiful in the way that people talk about when they describe beautiful women. She was not small or delicate. She was tall for a woman, almost as tall as Daniel, and broad in the shoulder, and she moved through the world with the direct, purposeful gait of someone who has things to get done and no patience for the long way around. Her hair was dark brown and she wore it plain, pulled back tight, because she did not have the time or the inclination for fuss. But when she laughed, and she did laugh, more than anyone else in our family, her whole face changed. It opened up. She looked like a different person. She looked like the person she might have been if the world she was born into had been organized differently. I was 13 and she was 19, which is a significant difference in most friendships. But Agnes had never been entirely comfortable with people her own age. The girls of her generation in the county were occupied with the things girls of that age were meant to be occupied with: courtship, the prospect of marriage, the careful management of their reputations in a way that would lead to a good match. Agnes was not uninterested in these things. She was impatient with the pretense involved in them. She talked to me instead. I was young enough that I was not a threat to anything, not part of any social calculation, and she could say what she thought without worrying about how it traveled. She said a great many things to me in the room we shared. Late at night, after the lamp was out, lying in the dark on our side-by-side beds. About the farm and the future and what she wanted from a life she was not sure the world was going to give her. About the way our father made decisions without ever asking anyone else what they thought. About the church and whether she believed what the minister said as certainly as she was expected to believe it. About books she had read and questions she could not answer. And about a man named Thomas Greer. Thomas Greer was 22 years old, the second son of a farm family 3 miles to the north of us. He was not a particularly high standing. The Greers were considered decent people but not the kind of family whose connection would elevate anyone. Agnes did not talk about him often, and when she did she was careful in a way she was not careful about most things, choosing her words slowly, which told me more than the words themselves. I was 13. I did not understand then what I understand now. What I understood was that she cared about him in a way that was different from the ordinary caring she extended to most people. Agnes had always been somewhat contained with people outside our family, polite, capable, but held back. With Thomas Greer there was something different. A softness. A kind of opening that I had only seen in her before when she was alone with me in the dark, talking about the things she could not say in daylight. I knew she cared about him. I knew it was something she was keeping inside the way you keep something warm under your coat in winter, privately, closely, afraid that the air would cool it if you let it out. What I did not know was how far it had already gone. And what I did not know was that by the time she told me even the little she told me, it was already too late for any outcome but the one that came. I think about Thomas Greer sometimes. I try to be fair and it is difficult. He was 22 years old and he left without a word and made no accounting for what his leaving cost Agnes, the months of hiding, the baby taken at birth, the years in Cincinnati working in other people's houses. He made no accounting for any of it. He simply went west, as men did, and I have no evidence that he carried the weight of it for even a day. That is the architecture of those years. The woman carried. The man walked away. And the family of the woman decided the only solution was to carry it in silence. I have lived long enough to know that silence is never a solution. It is only a postponement. The thing you silence does not disappear. It waits. The spring of 1853 was a cold one. I remember that because the kitchen garden was late and my mother was worried about it, and the worry about the garden was what was talked about at the table while the other thing was being managed in silence everywhere else in the house. I did not know at first. I was 13 and I had grown up in a household where certain things were not explained to girls until they were explained to them, and certain things were never explained at all, they were simply known, absorbed from the air of the place and the behavior of adults. I knew something was wrong with Agnes because her face had changed. She had gone still in a way she had never been still before. Not her usual purposeful stillness, the stillness of a person focused on a task. Something heavier. Something that kept her eyes down and her movements careful, as if she was afraid of drawing attention to herself. I asked her what was wrong one morning when we were alone in the kitchen. She told me to go help Mother with the washing. That was how I knew it was serious. Agnes never sent me away. My mother figured it out first. That was what happened in families in those years. The women knew things before the men did, and the question was always how long you could keep the knowing from crossing the line into the men's territory, where it would become action rather than grief. Women in those years had a great deal of practice at managing the interval between the moment of knowing and the moment when knowing became undeniable. They managed it the way they managed everything else, quietly, in the margins, without calling it by its name. My mother had perhaps 2 weeks of knowing before my father knew. I cannot say what those 2 weeks were like for her, because she never spoke of them to me and she is long dead. But I can imagine. I have had a long time to imagine. She was a woman who had been born into the same world as my father and who understood the arithmetic of what Agnes had done, understood it, probably, more precisely than Agnes did, having lived longer in a world that counted these things and did not forgive them. My father found out in May. I was in the barn when it happened. I did not hear the words, only the voices, coming through the wall of the house, and even through the planks I could hear the quality of my father's voice, and it was unlike anything I had heard from him before. Not loud. My father did not shout. He had never needed to. But there was something in the timbre of it that reached me in the barn and made me sit down on a hay bale and not move. The specific sound of a man's control being tested to its limit and not quite breaking is a sound I have never forgotten. It is a worse sound than shouting. It has more threat in it. Agnes did not make a sound. Or if she did, I could not hear it through the walls. My mother's voice came once, brief, and then stopped. The voices went on for a long time. And then they stopped too. When Agnes came out of the house that evening her face was completely composed. That was the thing that frightened me most. Not tears, composure. The specific, tight composure of a person who has been told exactly what is going to happen to them and has understood that there is nothing to be done about it. She came into the barn where I was still sitting on the hay bale. She sat down beside me. She did not say anything for a long time. Outside I could hear the ordinary sounds of the farm in the evening, the cows moving in their stalls, the hens settling, the distant sound of Daniel coming in from the far field. Then Agnes said, "You are not to worry about me." I said, "Agnes." She said, "Whatever happens, you are not to worry." I said, "What is going to happen?" She did not answer that question. What happened was this: for the next 4 months, from May through August of 1853, Agnes was kept in the house. She did not go to church. She did not go into town. On the rare occasions when neighbors came to call, she was in the back bedroom with the door closed, and my mother explained to the visitors, smoothly, without apparent effort, that Agnes had a persistent ague that was keeping her to bed. The neighbors accepted this. They may have known. In a county where people had watched each other for generations, it is difficult to believe they did not suspect. But there is a form of courtesy that consists of not seeing what you are not supposed to see, and our neighbors were people who practiced it. They had their own things they did not want seen. So the months passed. The kitchen garden came in late and then came in well, and my mother put up preserves and I weeded between the rows, and Agnes was in the house and the things she was carrying grew larger. And my father went about his days with the face of a man who is solving a problem he did not want, solving it methodically, without emotion, because emotion would not help and he had never found much use for it anyway. The baby was born in September of 1853. I was not in the room. I was not permitted near the room. My mother was in there, and a woman named Mrs. Adler who was known in the county for attending such situations, the ones that required discretion as much as skill. My father was in the kitchen. Daniel was in the fields, whether because he had been told to be there or because he had made that decision for himself, I do not know. I was in the barn again, the way I always seemed to end up in the barn when the important things were happening in the house. I could hear Agnes through the walls this time. I want to be honest about that. I heard her. I sat in the barn and I heard my sister, and I was 13 years old and I did not know what to do with what I was hearing, so I sat very still and I held my knees and I waited. The afternoon light came through the gap in the barn door and moved across the floor as the hours passed. I watched it move. I thought about nothing and everything and nothing again. It took most of the day. When it was over, my mother came to the barn door and told me to come inside and have supper and not ask questions. I came inside. I had supper. I did not ask questions. What I observed was this: Agnes was in the back bedroom with the door closed. My father's face was the face of a man who has completed a transaction he found distasteful but necessary. Mrs. Adler left before supper, driving her wagon back down the road with something wrapped in a blanket on the seat beside her. I did not see the baby. I never saw the baby. I asked Agnes about it later, weeks later, when she was allowed out of the bedroom and back into the common parts of the house, moving quietly as if she was not sure she had permission to take up space. She had lost weight and her face had a hollowed quality I had not seen before, the look of a person who has been through something physical and enormous and has come out the other side diminished. She moved differently. More carefully. Like a person who has learned that the floor can give way without warning. I asked her if the baby had been a boy or a girl. She said, "A girl." I said, "What did you name her?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I called her Frances." In my own mind. I said, "Did father let you hold her?" She turned away from me. She walked to the window. She stood there for a long time with her back to me, and I could see the way her shoulders held themselves, and I knew the answer without needing to hear it. The baby, Frances, in Agnes's mind, unnamed in the official understanding of the family, had been taken to a church orphanage in Louisville. My father had arranged it before the birth, with the same quiet, administrative efficiency with which he arranged everything. The orphanage was associated with a denomination my father had no connection to, in a part of the city where no one who knew the Benton family would have occasion to visit. It was, from his perspective, a clean solution. I have thought about that orphanage many times over the years. About the rooms in it. About whether they were warm in winter. About whether the women who ran it spoke kindly to the children or whether they were the kind of women who understood their work as correction rather than care. About a dark-haired baby girl who arrived in September of 1853 with no name that anyone acknowledged and no family that would claim her, and who grew up, if she grew up, knowing none of this. Knowing only whatever story she was told about herself, which was almost certainly not the true one. Thomas Greer left the county by the end of October. Whether my father spoke to him directly or whether he simply understood that it was prudent to leave, I have never known. He went west, as many men did in those years. I never heard his name again in our house. Agnes remained at home for another 9 months. She was 20 years old and she had nowhere else to go, and my father was not the kind of man who would put a daughter in the road regardless of what she had done. What he would do was make clear, through the complete and final silence on the subject, that the chapter was closed. The account had been settled. The family would continue. Agnes understood this. She had always been the one who understood things quickly. In June of 1854, when she was 20 years old, Agnes left Kentucky. My father had arranged a position for her through a connection in the church, quietly, at a distance, as a domestic servant in a household in Cincinnati, Ohio. She would work in another family's house. She would have a small wage and room and board. She would be out of the county and out of the way of anyone who might remember what had happened. The morning she left, I walked with her to the road where the wagon would collect her. She had one trunk. One. I had helped her pack it. I knew every item in it. She hugged me at the road. She held on for longer than she usually held on. I could feel the bones of her shoulders and the way she was trying to be still even while she was holding on. She said, "Don't let them forget me entirely." I said, "I won't." She stepped back. She looked at my face the way she had always looked at things she wanted to remember, steadily, carefully, as if she was storing it against a long absence she already knew was coming. Then the wagon came and she got in and I watched it go down the road and around the bend and out of sight. I was 14 years old. That evening my father said, at the supper table, in a voice entirely without feeling, "Agnes has taken a position in Cincinnati. We will not speak of her difficulties further." That was all. The name Agnes was never spoken in our house again. There is a particular kind of violence that is done through silence. I do not mean the comfortable silences between people who understand each other. I mean the enforced kind. The silence that is a command. The silence that says, the thing happened and is now required not to have happened, and anyone who speaks of it is choosing ruin over obedience. That was the silence my father installed in our house after Agnes left. And it was more present, more weight-bearing, more structurally important than any piece of furniture we owned. My brother Daniel did not speak of Agnes because he had always taken his cues from our father and our father's cue was absolute. I do not blame Daniel for this. He was a young man in a world that required young men to follow their fathers, and he followed. He was not cruel about it. He simply did not mention her, and after a few years I think he genuinely stopped thinking about her with any regularity, not because he was heartless but because men in those years were not encouraged to dwell on what could not be changed. My mother was different. I knew, in the way that children know things they have not been told, that my mother thought about Agnes. I could see it in certain moments, when a letter came to the house and she looked at it before handing it to my father, as if hoping for something. When something happened in the kitchen that Agnes would have done well and my mother's hands paused for just a moment before continuing. When she looked at me sometimes with an expression I could not name but which I understood was connected to my resemblance to my sister. She never said Agnes's name in front of my father. Whatever she said in private, to herself, in the night, in whatever conversation she carried on with God or with memory, I cannot know. She died in 1869 without having told me. My sister Ruth was 10 years old when Agnes left, and she had been too young to understand clearly what had happened. By the time she was old enough to ask, the silence was so thoroughly established that she absorbed it without question. For Ruth, Agnes was simply someone who was not mentioned, a space in the family where a person would have been, the way a missing tooth is a space where a tooth would have been. You know something belongs there. You learn not to press the space with your tongue. I was 14, then 15, then 16. And I obeyed the silence. I want to be clear about that. I obeyed it fully and consistently in every outward way that the silence required. Not out of agreement with my father's decision, I was never in agreement with it, not even in the first days when it was new and I was still numb from the morning at the road. But I obeyed it because I was a girl in my father's house and the house had a law and I was not old enough or free enough to break it. But I did not forget. That was the thing my father had asked for, silence and forgetting, and he achieved the silence but not the forgetting. I could not forget Agnes any more than I could forget the shape of my own hands. I kept her alive in myself. Privately, underground, in the way that I had learned to keep important things. I thought about her every day. I wondered where she was in Cincinnati, what house she was working in, whether the people there were kind to her or whether they spoke to her the way people speak to a domestic servant when they have decided that the servant is furniture rather than a person. I wondered if she had found out anything about Frances, whether the baby was well, whether anyone in the orphanage was gentle with her, whether she would grow up knowing she had a mother who had not wanted to give her away. I wondered if Agnes thought about me. In the mornings, making the bed in the room I no longer shared with anyone, I would sometimes stand for a moment with my hands on the quilt on her side of the room, which was my side now since there was no one to share it with, and I would think, she is in a house in Cincinnati and it is morning there too and she is making someone else's beds because that is her work now. They said silence was God's will. They never said it in those words. My father was not a man who invoked the Lord for his own purposes, at least not out loud. But the implication was there, woven into the fabric of how our household understood itself. The decent thing, the right thing, the thing God-fearing people did in situations like ours was to close the door and not reopen it. Shame was sealed in. Life continued. People did not speak of what they could not fix. I never believed that silence came from him. Even at 14, even in a house where that belief could not be expressed, I did not believe it. The Lord I had been taught about in church was not a God of erasure. He was a God who knew every sparrow that fell. He was not a God who required you to pretend your sister had not existed. But I was 14. And the silence was the law. So I obeyed. And I grieved in private. And I counted the days until I was old enough to have a life with different rules in it. I was married in April of 1855, 2 months after my 15th birthday. His name was George Sutton. He was 20 years old, the eldest son of a farm family from the next county, and he had come to Jefferson County with the intention of leasing land and beginning his own operation. He was a quiet man, not quiet like my father, which was a controlled, deliberate quiet with something held back behind it. George was quiet the way a field is quiet, not hiding anything, simply at rest. He was steady and even-tempered, and he treated me with a directness that I found, after 15 years in my father's house, almost startling in its plainness. My father arranged the marriage, as he had arranged Agnes's departure, with efficiency and without consulting me on the question of whether I found George Sutton agreeable. To be fair, I did find him agreeable. He was not unkind. He was not difficult. He asked me, once, before the arrangements were finalized, whether I had any objection, and I said no, and he nodded, and that was the extent of our courtship. I became Mary Sutton on the 18th of April, 1855. I was 15 years, 2 months, and 15 days old. I want to tell you something about leaving my father's house. I had expected to feel loss, for my mother, for Ruth, for the farm itself, for the familiar shape of the life I had known. And I did feel those things. My mother stood at the gate and watched the wagon leave, and I watched her watching until the road bent and she was out of sight, and I felt the specific grief of knowing that the daily life you had with a person is over even if the person themselves continues. But underneath all of that, and stronger than I had expected, was something else. Relief. I am not proud of the relief. I have examined it many times over the years, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath, and I have not arrived at a simple judgment about it. I was relieved to be out of a house where a person I loved had been erased from the daily record of our lives. I was relieved to be in a space where I was not required, every day, to maintain the fiction that Agnes had not existed. I was relieved to be somewhere I could think her name without it being a violation. George Sutton's farm was 6 miles from my father's house. Far enough. My new house was small, 2 rooms and a loft, with a kitchen garden out back that had been planted by the previous tenants and needed more work than it looked. The first week I spent in it I planted the garden the way Agnes had always planted ours, onions first, then carrots alongside, beans at the back where they would not shade the shorter plants. I did it exactly as she had done it, following her method with a precision that had nothing to do with practicality. It was the first thing I had done in years that felt like honoring her rather than erasing her. George noticed me working in the garden and said I seemed to know what I was doing with it. I said, "My sister taught me." He said, "You have a sister?" And I stopped with my hands in the soil and I thought, here is the first test of the silence my father had installed. Here is the first moment I can choose to carry it with me into my new life or set it down on the road I had just traveled. I said, "I had a sister. She went to Cincinnati." George said, "Is she well?" I said, "I hope so." He looked at me for a moment, that perceptive, unhurried look he had, and then he went back to the barn and asked nothing further. He was that kind of man. He understood when a thing was not entirely told and he did not press. I was grateful for that. And I was also aware, in the moment, that I had just imported the silence into my own house. Not because my father had commanded it there. Because I had carried it. Because I had learned to carry it so well that it had become the way I walked. In the 3rd year of my marriage, a letter arrived. George brought it in from town, a letter addressed in a hand I did not recognize, and I sat down at the kitchen table with it and my hands were shaking before I had broken the seal. It was from Agnes. She had found out, through a connection she did not explain, that I had married and that George's name was known in the county. She had written to the dry goods store in town on the chance that George might collect mail there. The letter was 2 pages. I read it 6 times. She was alive. She was in Cincinnati. She was working in a household whose address she gave. She asked after our mother. She asked after Ruth. She did not ask after our father. And at the bottom of the 2nd page, in smaller writing, added after she had apparently already decided the letter was finished, I think of Frances every day. I do not know if she is alive. I sat at that table for a long time with the letter in my hands. Then I wrote back. What followed was the longest project of my life. 50 years. That is not an exaggeration. From 1858, when Agnes's first letter reached me, to 1908, when I finally learned with certainty that she was gone, 50 years of a correspondence and a search that I conducted in the margins of my own life, hidden from my father while he lived, hidden from my children when they were young because I did not know how to explain it, carried in the particular underground way that women in those years carried the things the official version of their lives had no room for. Agnes and I wrote to each other for 18 years. From 1858 to 1876. The letters were not frequent, perhaps 4 or 5 a year on her end, less on mine during the years when the children were small and time was scarce and writing a letter required the kind of solitude that a household with young children does not reliably provide. But they came. And each one was its own small miracle of the fact of her continued existence, proof that the erasure my father had performed had not extended to the world beyond his farm. She stayed in Cincinnati through all those years. She worked as a domestic servant in several households over that time, moving when situations changed, a family that relocated, an employer who died, the ordinary migrations of that kind of work in those years. She never married. She told me once, in a letter I have long since lost to damp and the passage of years, that she had not found a reason to trust the arrangement. I understood what she meant. After what had happened with Thomas Greer, after the complete and silent abandonment that had followed what they had done together, I understood why she looked at the institution of marriage and found it an insufficient guarantee of anything. She was making her own way. It was a narrow way, a constrained way, the way available to a woman with no property and no family support and one mark against her that the world would never entirely stop counting. But she was making it. She had her own small room in the houses where she worked. She had her savings, which she described to me carefully in her letters, the sum she was building toward a future she did not entirely specify. She had her reading. Always her reading. She mentioned books in her letters the way other people mention neighbors, familiar presences, regularly consulted, sometimes argued with. She mentioned Frances in almost every letter. She had made inquiries through the church that ran the orphanage. Through a minister in Cincinnati she had found who was willing to carry questions on her behalf. The orphanage kept records, but the records were not shown to mothers, that was simply the policy, the wall behind which the institution conducted its business of transforming illegitimate children into legitimate ones, building new families on the erasure of the first. She knew the baby had been a girl. She had seen her for less than a minute before my father and Mrs. Adler removed the child from the room. 1 minute. That was what she had been given. 1 minute is enough to know a person, she wrote to me in 1862. I knew her. I cannot explain how, but I knew her. She had dark hair. She opened her eyes. I kept that letter until it fell apart from handling. I have the memory of it still, the exact shape of the sentences on the page, the way her handwriting became smaller in that last paragraph as if she was trying to fit more in than the paper had room for. The war years were strange years for our correspondence. George did not enlist. He was older than the first conscriptions required and his work on the farm was considered necessary, but the world around us changed in ways that made ordinary life feel provisional, uncertain, as if the ground itself had shifted. Agnes wrote less during those years. When she did write, her letters were shorter, the sentences more compressed, as if she was conserving something. In one letter from 1864 she said, "I think sometimes that I have become someone I would not have recognized at 19. I am not sure whether that is loss or only change." I wrote back, "Perhaps it is both." She wrote back, "Yes. Perhaps it is." The last letter from Agnes arrived in the spring of 1876. She was 42 years old. She said she had not been well, a persistent ailment she did not describe in detail, the kind of vagueness that told me she was protecting me from something specific. She said she had changed her lodgings and would write again when she was settled. She did not write again. I wrote to the last address she had given me. The letter came back. The family she had been working for had moved, and no one at the new address knew where Agnes had gone. I wrote to the church whose name she had mentioned. I wrote to a minister in Cincinnati whose name I found in a newspaper someone had brought through the county. I wrote to a woman Agnes had once mentioned as a neighbor in one of the houses where she had worked. None of my letters came back with anything useful. Some did not come back at all, which tells its own story about the reliability of the post in those years. Agnes had simply stepped sideways into the silence. And the search that had been quiet and manageable and something I did in the space between required tasks became something else. Something more present in me. Not outwardly, I did not abandon my household or neglect my children or give George reason to ask what was wrong. I kept the searching as I had always kept it, underground, in the margins. But it had moved from the background of my thinking to somewhere closer to the center. That is the thing about a person you love who disappears without accounting. The not knowing becomes a permanent condition of your thinking. You carry it the way you carry an old injury, some days barely aware of it, other days unable to set it down, some days both at once. I carried Agnes for 53 years after her last letter. The years between Agnes's last letter and the end of the century were full of the things that fill a life: children, labor, grief, the slow departure of the people who had made up the world of my childhood. George and I had 5 children. 3 survived to adulthood. The other 2, a son in 1861, a daughter in 1868, died young, in the way that children died in those years, from illnesses that came on fast and that the medicine of the time was not equipped to follow. I will not tell you that I was philosophical about these deaths. I was not. You are never philosophical about burying a child. You simply continue, because continuing is what is required of you, and over time the weight of it becomes ordinary in the way that all carried weight eventually becomes ordinary. My father died in 1858, before the war, from the fever I mentioned. He was 50 years old. He died as he had lived, contained, his affairs arranged, his face showing nothing that was not necessary to show. At his bedside in his last days he did not speak of Agnes. He had never spoken of Agnes. He died having succeeded, at least in his own accounting, in having managed the situation. I stood at his grave in the Jefferson County churchyard and I felt the complicated things you feel at a parent's grave. Grief, because he was my father and I had loved him in the way you love someone who has authority over you and sometimes uses it in ways that damage you. And something else, a sense that an authority had been removed. That the silence, which had been his to maintain and his to enforce, was now merely a habit. No longer a law. I wrote to Agnes a week after his funeral. Her reply arrived a month later, but it was as cold as the grave itself. She asked about the weather and the garden, but she did not mention his name once. My mother died in 1869. She had been fading since Ruth's birth, slowly, in the way that some women of her generation faded, not dramatically, not from a single illness, but from the accumulation of years of hard work and hard weather and hard grief, the kind of grief that has no official name because it is the grief of things that were never permitted to be mourned openly. She never told me whether she had been in contact with Agnes. I asked her once, in the last months of her illness, when we were alone in the house and she was resting in the bedroom where Agnes had spent those months in 1853. I asked her directly, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to see if she had ever dared to find out for herself. Do you know where Agnes is? She looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said, I hope she is well. That was all she gave me. Whether it meant she knew and would not say, or whether she had genuinely sealed the question inside herself so completely that she could no longer access it, I cannot tell you. I have thought about it for 50 years. My sister Ruth and I remained in correspondence throughout our lives, but we were never as close as Agnes and I had been. Ruth had grown up after the event, and Agnes was for her a rumor rather than a presence, a name that had once been in the household and then ceased to be, the way a piece of furniture is removed and after a while you stop noticing the place where it stood. I never told Ruth about the letters. I do not know entirely why. The secret had been mine for so long that sharing it felt like a kind of exposure I had not prepared for. And Ruth had her own life, her own family, her own accommodations with the world we had been raised in. I did not think the information would help her. George died in 1897, at 62, from a weakness of the heart that had been coming on for several years and that he had managed by simply not mentioning it until it could no longer be managed. That was George. He did not talk about his difficulties. He simply carried them until he couldn't. I sat beside his bed in the last days and held his hand and I thought about all the things I had never told him. Agnes most of all. 42 years of marriage and I had never told him the full story, only that I had a sister who had gone to Cincinnati, only that there had been a difficulty, only the outline of it. I had given him the shape of the secret but not the weight of it. He went to his grave not knowing he had a sister-in-law named Agnes who had died somewhere in Cincinnati. Not knowing there was a girl named Frances, a niece, by the loosest account, who might be alive somewhere and who had no idea she had a family at all. I am not certain he would have wanted to know. That is the other face of keeping secrets. Sometimes you protect the keeper, yes, but sometimes you protect the person from whom you are keeping it. George was a steady man but he had his own sorrows, and I had decided a long time ago that Agnes's story was not a burden I was going to add to his. Whether that was kindness or cowardice, I am still not entirely sure. I was 68 years old in 1908 when I finally learned what had happened to Agnes. I had been searching for 32 years since her last letter. 32 years of writing to churches and charitable organizations in Cincinnati and surrounding counties, of asking carefully and indirectly, without providing enough information that the asking itself would expose what I was trying to find. There was never enough context I could safely provide. I could not say, my sister gave birth out of wedlock in 1853 and our father sent her away and I have not heard from her since 1876. Each letter I wrote was a version of the truth that left out the parts one was still, after all those decades, still in the habit of protecting. What found me, in the end, was a death record. A woman who did clerical work for a Presbyterian charity in Cincinnati, a woman I had written to perhaps 10 years earlier who had made no response at that time, wrote to me in the spring of 1908 to say that she had been going through old files and had found a record that might be of interest. A woman named Agnes Benton, formerly of Kentucky, had died in Cincinnati in 1891. She had been a member of a small mission church near the waterfront. She had died of pneumonia in March of that year, at the age of 57. She had been buried in a municipal cemetery whose name the letter provided. 17 years earlier. I had been searching for 17 years for a woman who had been dead for 17 years. While I was writing letters and making quiet inquiries and carrying the weight of not knowing, Agnes had already been in the ground. I sat with that letter for the better part of a day before I could set it down. I sat at the kitchen table where I had sat so many times before, the same kitchen, the house George and I had shared, the house that was mine now alone, and I held the letter and I let the information move through me the way cold water moves through you when you drink it too fast. Not all at once. In stages. 57 years old. Agnes had been 57 years old when she died. She had been sick, as her last letter had suggested, and she had not recovered. She had died alone, as far as I could determine, no family named in the record, no next of kin, nothing but her name and the date and the mission church that had apparently known her well enough to note her passing. I thought about what her life had been. From the age of 20, when my father sent her to Cincinnati, to 57, when she died, 37 years of a life I had only glimpsed in letters and had spent 3 decades afterward trying to find. 37 years of rooms in other people's houses. Of earning her own wages in the narrow way available to a woman like her, doing the work that was available to women who had nothing, cleaning, cooking, caring for other people's children, watching other people's lives from the position of someone hired to make those lives easier. 37 years of carrying Frances in her mind the way I had carried Agnes in mine. I found no record of Frances. I tried. The Louisville orphanage Agnes's daughter had been taken to had burned in 1871, and whatever records it had kept went with it. Whether Frances had survived to adulthood, whether she had been adopted into a family who loved her, whether she had grown up with any knowledge at all of the woman in Cincinnati who called her Frances in the private record of her own mind, I do not know. I cannot know. That is the final cost of what my father did. Not one erasure. 2. Agnes erased from our family. Frances erased from Agnes. A chain of erasures, each one generating the next, the way one bad season can blight the next and the one after that, the damage compounding through the years. Our family's sin was not poverty. It was not even what happened between Agnes and Thomas Greer, which was ordinary enough in its human dimensions, a young woman who trusted a young man who did not deserve it, a story older than any century I have lived in. The sin was the pretending. The decision that reputation was worth more than Agnes. That the maintenance of my father's standing in the county was worth more than my sister's presence in her daughter's life, more than her name in our house, more than the truth of what we were to each other. They said silence was God's will. I never believed that. I said it then and I say it now, at 89 years old, with no one left to argue with me about it. I do not believe that God requires us to pretend the people we love have not existed. I do not believe He counts that as faithfulness. I believe He counts it as the thing it is, a choice made by frightened people who valued the good opinion of their neighbors above the obligations of their blood. My granddaughter was born 11 years ago. I named her Agnes. My daughter Sarah asked me where the name came from, and I told her, for the first time in my life, I told the entire story from the beginning. The farm. The tobacco fields. The spring of 1853. The baby carried out the door in Mrs. Adler's arms. The wagon going down the road in June of 1854. The letters for 18 years. The 32 years of searching. The letter from Cincinnati in 1908 with its single flat sentence about a death I had missed by 17 years. My daughter listened without interrupting. When I finished she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I said, "I learned the silence too young. And it held longer than I meant it to." Agnes Elizabeth Benton. Born 1834 in Jefferson County, Kentucky. Died 1891 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Daughter of Caleb and Hannah Benton. Sister of Daniel, Mary, and Ruth. Mother of a girl she called Frances, who was taken from her in the first minute of that girl's life and never given back. That is who she was. That is the whole of it. My family told me to forget her. I was never able to do it. And I am not sorry that I failed.